Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Welcome to the 44th lecture of this course in Introductory Economics. The topic for today's lecture will be International Trade and Finance. Now, you know that we are constantly reminded that the world is fast developing into a global village and that we are living in this global village. Now, there are many aspects to globalization: political, social, economic. So as far as the economic aspects and implications of globalization are concerned, it is very important for us economists to understand how globalization affects any individual economy. Now, the reason why we focus on international trade and finance in assessing the impact that globalization will have on any individual country's economy is because of what we discussed in the balance of payments lectures. If you remember, we noted that there were two types of transactions that any country could have with the outside world, at least in the economic vein. And the transactions were those which happened on the current account, that is trade transactions, the exchange of goods and services, and those that happened on the capital account, that is the exchange of financial resources, financial payments. Now, international trade relates to transactions on the current account, and international finance relates to transactions on the capital account. That would be a crude categorization, but I think it will suffice at this introductory level. So let's start by looking at international trade. Let's start by looking at some international trade statistics. Now, international trade has increased in value by 20 times since the late 1920s. So today, the value of trade is 20 times what it was in the late 1920s. That is a huge increase. So the importance of trade has increased over time. Another statistic which gives you the same result or leads you to the same conclusion is that the share of exports in GNP, the share of world exports as a percentage of US GNP has risen from 30% to 60% over the same period, that is from 1930 to 2000. So that means that trade as a proportion of GNP or total income has become higher. Has become more important. Another statistic that is of interest is that 50% of all world trade transactions happen between rich countries, which are also called advanced countries or developed countries or industrialized countries. Mainly the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development group of countries. Whereas 14% of all world trade transactions happen between poor countries, that is, less developed countries or developing countries, a number of terms used for these countries. And 36% happen between poor and rich countries. Another important statistic is the ratio of exports of manufactures to exports of primary commodities. Primary commodities are cotton, minerals, metals, etc. Now, this ratio has changed from 1:1 at the end of the 1920s to 3:1, reflecting the increased importance of manufactured goods in relation to primary commodities. Now, the reason that these trade transactions have increased at such a fast rate is that there are gains from trade. That is, countries gain from trade, they benefit from trading goods and services. And while the intuition of this may sound simple, economists have tried to get to the bottom of why countries gain from trade. That is, what are the bases of trade between countries. The argument that economists give is that it is comparative advantage which drives international trade or the gains from trade. Countries which have a comparative advantage in one good will try to export that good to countries which have a comparative disadvantage in the production of that good. Note that this is different from absolute advantage, but in order to illustrate this distinction and also to show the gains from trade, we'll have to make use of some graphs. So let's go to our first slide for today. Now let's assume that we have two countries, the US and the UK, and that two goods can be produced, or two commodities can be produced, cotton or food. And we assume that both the US and the UK have identical resources. That is, they have the same amount of labor, same amount of capital. Now we are given this information. That is, the US can produce, if it devoted all its resources to the production of cotton, 40 units of cotton. Whereas if it devoted all its resources, all of its labor and capital to the production of food, it could produce 60 units of food. The UK, on the other hand, by devoting the same amount of resources to the production of cotton, could produce 30, and if it devoted all its resources to the production of food, it could produce 20 units of food. Now, obviously, you can see that the US is more efficient at the production of both cotton and food. That is, the US has an absolute advantage over the UK in both cotton and food production. So does this mean that the US should produce for the whole of the world? That is, the UK should not produce any good? That is, the US, because it's more efficient, should take over the production of both cotton and food? Economists say no. Now, in order to look at why, let's start by first plotting the production possibilities frontiers for both US and UK. Now, on this first graph, you have the production possibility frontiers for the UK shown by K2, K0. And this is drawn in CF space. This is exactly the same kind of production possibilities frontier that we drew or learned to draw in the first few lectures. Then we have the production possibility frontier for the US, which is denoted by S0, S1. Now let's assume that the starting consumption and production point for the UK economy is point Y. That is, the UK economy produces 6 units of cotton and 16 units of food and consumes the same amount. Whereas the US economy produces at point X, that is 36 units of food and 16 units of cotton. And it also consumes the same amount because there is no trade happening. Now, the total amount of food units that are being produced by the UK and US combined are 16 plus 36, that is equal to 52, whereas the total amount of cotton units that are being produced by both the UK and US combined are 6 plus 16, that is 22 units of cotton. Now, let's see if there are gains to be made from trade. But before we get to that, let's see what the basis of trade would be. Now, we noted earlier that it is comparative advantage which drives trade. So let's see whether the US has a comparative advantage in both goods. Is it possible for it to have it? Or is it possible for the UK to also productively produce one of the two goods? We noted earlier that the US has an absolute advantage in the production of both cotton and food. But as we will see shortly, this does not preclude the possibility of the UK also producing something to the mutual benefit of both the US and the UK. Now, how can we come to that conclusion? We come to that conclusion by looking at the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of cotton or food for the US, and then looking at the opportunity cost of producing a unit of cotton and food for the UK. So let's see what the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of cotton is in the US. The opportunity cost is simply the number of units that could have been produced if cotton were not being produced, right? So what is the opportunity cost of producing 40 units of cotton? It's 60 units of food. And what is the per unit of cotton opportunity cost? It would simply be 60 divided by 40. That is 1.5 F, where F is the units of food. Similarly, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of food can be calculated as 40 over 60 C, that is 0.67 C. Similarly, we can now calculate the opportunity costs of producing 1 unit of cotton and 1 unit of food in the UK, and those come out to 0.67 F and 1.5 C respectively. Note now that the opportunity cost of producing cotton in the UK is 0.67 F, and this is lower than the opportunity cost of producing cotton in the US, that is 1.5 F. By contrast, the opportunity cost of producing food in the US is 0.67 C, which is lower than the opportunity cost of producing food in the UK, which is 1.5 C. Therefore, if we go by the principle that countries should produce the good in which they have a comparative advantage, then here the US should produce food and the UK should produce cotton. So that means that despite the fact that the US had absolute advantage in the production of both goods, it is not appropriate or sensible for the US to produce both goods. It is appropriate for the US to produce the good at which it is relatively more productive compared to the other good. Similarly, the UK should produce the good in which it is relatively more productive compared to the other good. Therefore, it will make sense for the US to produce at point S1 in its production possibilities frontier, whereas the UK should produce at point K2 on its production possibilities frontier. So the US will produce 60 units of food, whereas the UK will produce 30 units of cotton. Now let's see what the implications of this choice are for the gains from trade. That is it possible for post-trade consumption in the US and UK to be higher than the original points at which they were consuming, that is at points Y and X? Now as you can see, the UK will now produce 30 units of cotton, whereas the US is producing 60 units of food. But it is possible for the UK to now consume at a point like Y prime and for the US to consume at a point like X prime. How? Well, it is simple. UK will sell 20 units of cotton to the US and the US will sell 20 units of food to the UK. The exchange price is 1 cotton unit is equal to 1 food unit. And this, as you can see, is the slope of the new consumption possibilities frontier, which is now permitted or which has now been made possible by the opening up of trade between UK and US. So at points X prime and Y prime, you can look at what the consumption of UK and US is. UK will now consume 20 units of food and 10 units of cotton, having sold 20 units of cotton to the US. And the US will now consume 40 units of food and 20 units of cotton, having sold 20 units of food to the UK. The total units of food that are now being produced are 60, whereas the total units of cotton that are now being produced are 30. Therefore, if you compare these figures with what was prevailing earlier, we have 8 more units of food being produced and 8 more units of cotton being produced. And this is what gains of trade is all about. That is, there is now a greater, larger production of goods because of the exploitation of comparative advantages. So comparative advantage offers a very good way for nations to make gains from trade. But in our previous example, we conveniently skipped the question of what was driving the comparative advantage of US and UK. That is, why is it that the US was more efficient in the production of food, that is on the basis of opportunity cost, whereas the UK was more efficient at the production of cotton, that is in relative terms. Earlier we noted that the US was more efficient in absolute terms, but we are talking about relative terms, that is comparative advantage. Now the earliest thinking on comparative advantage was by Ricardo, who said that it was the labor productivity differentials of people, of countries, which determined their comparative advantage. So if US labor was more productive in the production of food relative to cotton, then that is what the comparative advantage of the US will be in, that is in the production of food. Whereas if the labor in the UK is more productive or more efficient in the production of cotton relative to food, then that is what the comparative advantage of the UK will be in, that is in the production of cotton. So that was the earliest thinking. This was revised in the mid-20th century by economists Heckscher, Olin, and Samuelson, who gave the theory that it is the factor endowments of countries that determine their comparative advantages. That is, if a country has more labor, then that country will be better off or more efficient in the production of goods which are or which use labor more intensively. Whereas if a country has more capital relative to labor, then it makes sense for that country to produce goods which use their abundant factor, that is capital, more intensively. तो अगर पाकिस्तान और अमेरिका दो मुल्क हैं और पाकिस्तान के पास लेबर ज्यादा है और अमेरिका के पास कैपिटल ज्यादा है, मशीनरी ज्यादा है, और दो तरह की चीजें पैदा हो सकती है, पैदा की जा सकती हैं, यानी कि लेट्स से एक तरफ कपास है और एक तरफ गाड़ियां हैं, तो किसको गाड़ियां पैदा करनी चाहिए और किसको कपास पैदा करनी चाहिए? The argument that Heckscher-Ohlin gave, or the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson trio gave, was that it makes sense for the US to produce the cars because the production of cars uses the abundant factor of the US more intensively. Whereas Pakistan should focus on the production of cotton because the production of cotton uses the abundant factor that Pakistan has, that is labor, more intensively. Now this raises two important questions. The first is that will Pakistan forever be involved in the production of cotton? Will it never graduate and move into the production of manufactured goods or cars or aeroplanes? That's one question. And the second is it in Pakistan's long-term or even short-term interest to be in the production of cotton? Or should it move to the production of some other kinds of goods? Now these are arguments which were given by people who were against free trade. They said that if you allow free trade to happen, then countries will remain stuck in the types of goods that they are producing. So if Pakistan has a comparative advantage in labor, in the production of cotton, then, and if you allow for free trade, then that's the only thing that Pakistan will be allowed to produce. And if similarly the US has a comparative advantage in the production of cars, and if you have free trade, then the US will forever be involved in the production of cars, right? So this was the argument that many people were not comfortable with. They said, no, it's important for countries like Pakistan or poor countries to develop, to move up the ladder of comparative advantage. So gradually we should move from cotton into textiles, into other goods, and eventually into the production of cars. So they gave many arguments for why it might be in the interests of a country to not have free trade until it had developed the comparative advantage to its own liking. That is, Pakistan's comparative advantage should not be viewed in static terms. It needed to be viewed in dynamic terms. That comparative advantage can be changed. So a country should enter into the international trading arena at the time that it believes that its comparative advantage is to its own liking, that it can integrate into the international trading system at favorable terms. And so many countries used restrictions on trade, especially restrictions on imports, in order to help their industrialists develop a comparative advantage in manufactured goods. Now these arguments are often called infant industry arguments or protectionist policies. That is, when a country imposes restrictions on trade, on free trade, because it wants to build its comparative advantage or change its comparative advantage. And that is only possible, according to some, if the country is shielded from goods being produced by other countries. So if a country wants to become very good at the production of cars, it cannot allow cars to come in freely from Japan and other countries, because if that happens, then its own industry will never develop. So it needs some breathing space. And in order to get that breathing space, many countries have resorted to the use of quotas and tariffs. And these are imposed on imports. They are like a tax, a sales tax on imports. So any car that comes in from Japan or from the US will have a tariff slapped on it, which would, let's say, double its price or triple its price. And that would make it worthwhile for local consumers to stick to the cars being produced locally, right? So that was the argument given by some for imposing import tariffs. But import tariffs are taxes. Now remember that the fact that taxes are distortionary does not mean that it is not desirable to invoke them or impose them in certain situations. No, it can be desirable, and we looked at the conditions for that. Similarly, people argued that import tariffs were desirable because they helped industrialists, local industries, build comparative advantage in industries like cars or other industries, chemicals, steel, etc., which were a source of long-term advantage or strategic benefit to the nation. And therefore, it made sense to have this temporary distortion in order to allow the country to make long-term gains. However, taxes and tariffs have welfare implications. That is, they tend to have a deadweight loss, introduce a deadweight loss to society. And it's useful to look at how the welfare loss of an import tariff would arise. That is, when a country or a government imposed a tariff on a certain import, what would the implications be on welfare for the society as a whole? Note that many countries in the developing countries, many governments have used import tariffs in order to finance their expenditures. Right? So many countries which were fiscally impotent could not raise taxes from direct sources, could not enforce the income tax system, conveniently relied on import tariffs in order to generate revenues and finance their spending. So let's get back to the question of how the welfare implications of an import tariff can be studied. Let's go to a graph. Now, as you can see, my friends, we have the demand and supply curves, the local demand and supply curves of a particular market. Let's say cars. And the world price of cars is given by the line P1. This is in a way the supply curve for the world. That is the price at which the world is willing to supply any number of cars. Then we have a tariff that is imposed by the government, which has a size of small t, which raises the world price to P1 plus t, that is equal to P2. Now, what would be the original point of consumption for local consumers? Local consumers would consume at the point of intersection between the world price and the demand curve. And before the tariff, this point would be point K. However, after the tariff, this point would be point J. Now, what are the welfare implications of this switch from point K to point J? Note that when the consumers were consuming at point K, they were consuming a total quantity of Q2, out of which Q1 were the amount of cars being produced by the local industrialists, whereas Q2 minus Q1 was the amount of imports from the rest of the world. Similarly, once you move to point J, the total consumption of cars falls from Q2 to Q4, whereas the total supply of cars domestically increases from Q1 to Q3. So imports fall from Q2 minus Q1 to Q4 minus Q3. Now, in order to look at the welfare implications, let's sum up the surpluses that accrue to different parties. So let's look at the consumers first and the pre-tariff case. In the pre-tariff case, consumer surplus is given by the triangle FKP1, whereas producer surplus is given by the triangle LP1S. And you know how these triangles give producer and consumer surpluses. This was covered in an earlier lecture when we discussed the welfare loss of a tax. Now, the total consumer surplus and producer surplus is given by the area of the shape FKSL. Now, what happens once the tariff is imposed and we move to point J? The consumer surplus falls to FJP2. The producer surplus, the local producer surplus, rises to LGP2, and the total becomes FJGL plus the area C, which is equivalent to the tariff revenue that the government gets. That is the small t, the difference between P2 minus P1 multiplied by the total quantity of imports, which is now Q4 minus Q3. Now, there will be some area which will be left out, and that area is represented by triangles A and B. This is the welfare that earlier accrued to the consumers but has now been lost. This is the deadweight loss of the import tariff. Despite these welfare losses, many countries in the latter part of the 20th century, both industrialized and developing or poor countries, resorted to the imposition of import tariffs based on the arguments that I gave earlier. That is, import tariffs allow the generation of revenue, allow the local industries to develop comparative advantage, which is necessary for the country when it is thinking of its long-term interests. Now, these were moves to restrict trade, but there have also been contemporaneous moves to liberalize trade in the world. So let's look at the forces which have been moving or which have been operating in order to boost free trade in the world. Let's look at the institutional structure of the international trading system. Now, the first major international trading institution that was formed was the GATT, which was formed in the late 1940s in Geneva by a group of 23 advanced countries. The GATT stands for the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The GATT was founded on three major principles. The first one was of most favored nation, the MFN principle. And this meant that any contracting member of the GATT, that is, any country which was a member of the GATT framework, would grant imports from any other country the same treatment as it would grant imports from a third country, which was also a member. So if you had the US as the importing country, and you had Switzerland and the UK exporting their goods to the US, then the US was required to give the same treatment to imports from the UK as it would give to imports from the Switzerland producers. This was the most favored nation principle, that every country had the most favored nation status. The other principle was that once the goods came into the economy, they would be granted a similar status, a similar treatment as products of being produced by domestic producers. That is, after the imposition of duty, there would be no other discrimination between foreign imports or goods imported from abroad and the locally produced goods. Now, the second principle of the GATT was reciprocity. That is, if one member country of the GATT gave some trade concession to another member country, then that receiving member country has to reciprocate and give the same concession to the first country. So if the US granted an import tariff or duty reduction to imports from UK, then the UK would also have to grant a similar reduction to imports from the US. The third principle of the GATT was that there would be no non-tariff barriers. That is, the only type of barriers to free trade between contracting members would be in the nature of tariffs. That is, when you impose a 10% extra duty, import duty on imports of a good, or 20%. There would be no quantitative restrictions, that is, outright quota restrictions on the amount of goods that can come into the economy. These were considered highly distortionary and were outlawed by the GATT system. Now, initially there were only 23 countries which were members of the GATT, but this number rose to 123 by the late 1980s, and this included a large number of developing countries as well, of poor countries. And the GATT system was replaced in 1995 by a formal institution called the World Trade Organization. Now, while the GATT and the WTO, which is its son or daughter organization, as you might call it, have been able to bring together many countries and get them to discuss important issues in the trading arena, it has also been a source of great conflict, especially between developing countries on the one hand and rich countries on the other. Developing countries feel that the GATT system is biased in favor of the rich countries. And one example of this is that the GATT system did not talk about agricultural subsidies and textile quotas which were imposed or practiced by the rich countries until and sort of even today these are practiced. But the GATT system did not allow discussion to happen on these issues. These were sensitive issues for rich countries, and these were not allowed to be discussed within the GATT framework. In fact, these were the issues that were most relevant for developing countries. But LDCs felt that the agenda for these meetings was set up by rich countries, and therefore the framework was biased against them. Now, an alternative to the multilateral trading system, or this multilateral institution, GATT or WTO, has been regional trade institutions. Now, Pakistan is also a member of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and SAFTA, which is the Associated Free Trade Agreement for South Asia. This has not been one of the more successful free trade regional agreements, but there have been some very powerful and strong free trade agreements, such as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. There have also been free trade agreements struck in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in sub-Saharan Africa, and some of these have been quite successful. So regionalism offers another way of resolving trade-related issues, trade-related problems between countries. One obvious question arises: is it possible for regionalism and multilateralism, that is, the regional approach to free trade and the multilateral approach to free trade, to coexist? It's a very difficult question, because if you are a member of a regional bloc, then you will like to serve the interests of all the members within the bloc, and the bloc as a whole might be very hostile to countries which are outside the bloc. Whereas once you are in the realm of multilateral negotiations, you look at the world as a whole. Every country is equal. You are not members of individual regional blocs. You are members of the world. So you are likely, or you are expected to give the same weightage to other countries' interests, even if they are not members of the particular bloc that you belong to. Now, the debate on whether the WTO has been a good force for the world as a whole, for developing countries in particular, whether regionalism offers an other option, an alternative for developing countries and for other countries in general, these are very difficult debates to resolve, especially when you have only half a lecture to devote to them. But this is just an introduction for you to enable you to understand the kind of issues that arise in international trade. Certainly when you take a full course in this area, international trade and finance, then you will be dealing with these issues in much greater detail. We will, however, revert to the international trading system and the different trade choices that countries have made in our next lecture, when we look at the problems of developing countries in particular. Let's now move to international finance, my friends. International finance relates to the free flow, or the flow of financial capital across borders, that is, across countries. International trade dealt with the flow of goods and services. International finance relates to the flow of financial capital. Now, while we said that international trade has become much more important today than it was, let's say, in the 1920s, the growth in the cross-border flows of financial capital have been even more astronomical. That is, much greater than the growth in the trade-related flows. So earlier on, it was customary to have the size of capital flows across countries to be similar to the size of financial flows or trade-related flows between countries. But today, the size or the volume of capital flowing across the world from one country to another is 100 times the size of the trade-related capital flows. So a huge difference. The importance of the capital account in this sense has become much greater relative to the importance of the current account. Earlier, developing countries and rich countries could focus on what was happening to their current account, and that was enough for them to ensure that their balance of payments position was stable and fine. But now it's not possible to do that. The capital account has become increasingly important, and attention needs to be paid to how a country can manage its capital account. Now, what are the different ways in which money can come into an economy? You can have foreign direct investment. That's one type of inflow on the capital account. You can have foreign portfolio investment, where people invest in your country's stocks and bonds, and you can invest in other countries' stocks and bonds and assets. Then there is the option of debt or borrowing. and the option of financial aid, assistance, concessional assistance, either in grant form or in loan form. All these are forms of financial capital flows. Now, what are the arguments for and against the free flow of financial capital? Just as we saw that there were certain arguments against free trade, that is, there was a rationale for why certain countries imposed import tariffs, which was a restriction on free trade, and why other countries thought that free trade was good, and their arguments were based on the gains from trade that countries can benefit from. Now, the same kind of arguments can be given in the context of capital mobility. That is, whether financial capital should be fully mobile, should it be allowed to go across the planet from one country to another, or whether there should be restrictions or controls on the movement of financial capital. Let's look at the classical case which is presented in favor of free capital mobility. Let's go to a slide. Now, the case for free capital mobility was made by McDougall, or at least formalized by McDougall first in 1960. The simple representation of his argument could be the one that is shown here. Here you have two vertical axes and one horizontal axis. But think of the horizontal axis as also two vertical axes. So for the rich countries which have their vertical axis, the right vertical axis, the horizontal axis moves from right to left. Whereas for the poor countries, the horizontal axis moves from left to right. Now on the vertical axis, we have the interest rate on capital. This is financial capital. And on the horizontal axis, we have the quantity of financial capital. Next, we have drawn the demand and supply curves of capital in both rich countries and poor countries. So going from right to left, we draw the downward sloping demand curve for capital for rich countries and the upward sloping supply curve for capital for rich countries, DR and SR respectively. And this gives rise to the equilibrium ER when there is no capital mobility between rich and poor countries. So what will be the interest rate that would clear the market? The interest rate that would clear the market in the rich country would be IR, whereas the quantity that would clear the market, the quantity of financial capital, would be QR. Now, we have similar graphs for poor countries, for the poor country as well. So we have the supply curve of capital for the poor country and the demand curve of capital for the poor country or countries as a whole. And the equilibrium there is struck at EP, and the clearing interest rate is IP, that is the interest rate prevailing in poor countries. The quantity of financial capital that clears the market is QP. Now, as you can see, the interest rate that clears the market in poor countries is higher, and this is mainly because the supply of capital is low in poor countries, whereas the interest rate that clears the market in the rich countries is very low, IR. And this is mainly because the supply of capital is very high, very much to the left in rich countries. McDougall said that it is possible for capital mobility, that is the flow of capital between the rich and the poor countries, to enable the interest rate to be brought down in poor countries and the interest rate to be raised in rich countries. So rich countries would benefit by giving some of their capital or lending some of their capital to poor countries. Poor countries will benefit because the interest rate in their economy will go down, whereas rich countries will benefit because they will now be able to earn a higher interest rate on their capital. The new equilibrium, according to him, was where the two demand curves intersect. That is, the demand curve for capital mobility would allow the equilibrium point to move to something like E star, where the interest rate that clears the market is I star for the whole of the world, and the equilibrium quantities of capital are QR prime in the rich countries and QP prime in the poor country. Now let's consolidate the case for capital mobility, that is in favor of capital mobility. First, interest rates in poor countries would fall, thereby encouraging more investment and therefore generating more growth, enabling more growth to happen. Many developing countries are constrained by the lack of capital. There is not enough money that can be invested and that can generate the growth that those countries are capable of generating. So financial capital, or the flow of financial capital, could remove that constraint and would lower the interest rate, thereby boosting both domestic investment and also the foreign investment that has come in. Then the free movement of capital allows consumption smoothing also. That is, if a country is hit by a negative shock, let's say, right? And if suddenly the growth in the economy has suffered, if the domestic consumption was constrained by what the domestic income was, then the consumption would have to fall drastically if income fell drastically, right? If there was some natural catastrophe, let's say, some natural calamity, an earthquake or something, and there was a big shock and incomes fell, then people would have to reduce their consumption commensurately as well. But if the flow of capital was allowed, then countries could borrow from abroad in times of need and then pay back this amount when they had enough money to pay back. That is, when there was a downturn in the economy, a recession in the economy, countries could borrow from abroad and still maintain their higher level of consumption. And once the economy went into boom, and as you know, countries go through these recession boom cycles, then they could repay the amount back and thereby repay the debt. So consumption smoothing was another argument which was presented by proponents of free capital mobility. The third one related to risk diversification, and that is that global investors would get the opportunity to put their money in different baskets, so to speak. As they say, never put all your eggs in one basket. Similarly, when one is investing one's money, one doesn't just invest it in one particular investment or one particular asset. तो अगर आपके पास 100 रुपए हैं और आपने उसको इन्वेस्ट करना है, तो आप सारा पैसा किसी एक जमीन में नहीं डाल देंगे, सारा पैसा किसी एक स्टॉक या शेयर में नहीं डालेंगे. आप कोशिश करेंगे कि मुख्तलिफ चीजों में अपना पैसा लगाएं, ताकि अगर कोई एक चीज पर नुकसान हो भी तो बाकी चीजें जो हैं वो आपके मुनाफे को बाकी रखें. So the same principle applied to investors of different countries. And the investor of any country could now invest in assets of different countries and thereby lower his risk, that is, diversify his risk. The final point or advantage of free capital mobility is that it allows fiscal policy to become very effective when there is a fixed exchange rate regime. That is, fiscal policy has a full income effect, full effect on income when the exchange rate is fixed and when there is full capital mobility. And the argument here is that full capital mobility does not allow crowding out to take place, does not allow the crowding out of investment or net exports to take place. Let's look at how this happens through the ISLM framework. Now, as you can see, my friends, we've drawn the traditional ISLM curves. The IS curve is downward sloping, the LM curve is upward sloping. We are in IY space. But we've also drawn another line here, which is the BP line. This is the balance of payments line. And this is a horizontal line that intersects the vertical axis at I star. Now, I star here simply stands for the interest rate along which the balance of payments is in equilibrium. So if the interest rate rose above I star and we had a fixed exchange rate regime, what would happen? We would have capital inflows. What would those capital inflows do to foreign exchange reserves of the central bank? They would rise. This would cause an increase in the monetary base, and this would then cause the money supply to expand and therefore cause the interest rate to fall back to I star. Similarly, any interest rate below I star would be consistent with a balance of payments deficit. And this is because the exchange rate has been fixed and the interest rate must equal the foreign interest rate plus the expected change in depreciation, which is 0 because the exchange rate is fixed, and therefore the interest rate is equal to the foreign interest rate. Now let's imagine what happens when there is a fiscal policy expansion, that is shown by 1 here. The IS curve moves to the right, the interest rate goes up to ID, that is higher than I star, which is required for balance of payments equilibrium. We are at point E1. What happens on the balance of payment side? What is happening on the capital account? At this stage, domestic interest rates are higher than those required for balance of payments equilibrium. Therefore, money will start flowing into our country, and this will cause a surplus on the balance of payments, which will be reflected in the foreign exchange assets of the central bank, will cause an increase in M0 and therefore lead to a monetary increase. This monetary increase will be reflected by a rightward shift in the LM curve, as shown by 2 here. So equilibrium finally would settle at E2, with a larger increase in income being permitted because of the existence of the BP line. Without the balance of payments mechanism, equilibrium would have been at E1, with higher interest rates causing crowding out of investment and a higher exchange rate causing crowding out of net exports. But under fixed exchange rates, the balance of payments mechanism provides a way of expanding the money supply in a way so as to accommodate the increase in fiscal expenditures. Now, those were the arguments that are presented in favor of capital mobility. What are the arguments against? A first argument that is presented is that capital mobility is a way of allowing foreigners to take control of your strategic assets. So by encouraging foreign direct investment or other types of investment, you are allowing them or foreigners or outside citizens to take control of what could be strategic industries and strategic sectors of your economy. And this is especially the case when foreign investors come in and participate heavily in the local financial system or in the mining sector, things like that, or in the communication sector. And when this happens, people feel that the strategic sectors of the domestic economy are slipping from the local people, local citizens' hands into the hands of foreign citizens. This is one argument. Another argument which is often put forward by poor countries, or the countries which are most likely to receive capital inflows from rich countries. These poor countries argue that capital mobility favors the rich countries. It is they who benefit from the higher returns that are being made in poor countries. So the poor countries argue that whenever it is in the interests of the rich countries, they argue the case for capital mobility. That is, whenever the interest rates in rich countries fall very low, then rich countries recognize the need for investing their capital in poor countries. But as soon as interest rates rise in their own countries, or some adverse development, temporary adverse development takes place in the recipient country, in the poor countries, then immediately they withdraw their capital, causing these periods of booms and recessions which are very dangerous and very, very costly to these poor countries. Indeed, many countries have been thrown into this cycle of boom and recession in Latin America and in East Asia because of the way the capital has flown from rich countries to poor countries. Earlier we said that free capital mobility allows consumption smoothing. That is, when poor countries would need the capital most, they would be able to borrow it. And when they would be in boom time, they would be able to repay it, right? But the opposite is seen to happen. When countries need the money most, capital does not flow to them. Capital is taken back to the rich countries. Whereas when countries do not need more capital, then capital keeps coming in. That is, there is overinvestment and it encourages overconsumption, causing the economies to overheat and then go into possible financial crises. And this happened in the early 1980s with a lot of Latin American countries in the debt crisis, the famous Latin American debt crisis. And many countries in East Asia suffered from similar crises in the late 1990s, that is in 1997-98. A final argument which is presented against capital mobility is that monetary policy loses its effectiveness when there is free capital mobility. Now, in our earlier example, we saw that when the interest rate is higher than the I star required interest rate, there is a capital account surplus, and this feeds into the money supply. This is exactly the problem that monetary policy faces. Whenever there is a change in the money supply which tries to lower the interest rate, then that lower interest rate will cause a balance of payments deficit and reduce the money supply, thereby bringing the LM curve back to its original position. Therefore, if the monetary authorities tried to increase interest rates, the balance of payment surplus would bring the money supply curve back, the LM curve, back to its original place. If the monetary authorities wanted to expand money supply and reduce interest rates, then given fixed exchange rates, a balance of payments surplus deficit would occur, and this would cause the monetary expansion to be neutralized and totally offset. So monetary policy would be totally ineffective under free capital mobility given fixed exchange rates. Now, this relationship of capital mobility and fiscal policy and monetary policy is very important, or is useful to discuss in the context of fixed versus floating exchange rates. We've been talking about these two types of exchange rate regimes, but we haven't looked at the advantages and disadvantages that these two types of regimes might have. This we will have to leave till our next lecture because we're running out of time for this one. My friends, we come to the end of today's lecture. What we've discussed is just a very basic introduction to international trade and finance issues. I wanted to include this as part of your course because I think it's important for you to at least know about the issues that confront an economy in the arenas of international trade and finance, especially when we are reminded all the time that we are living in a global village and the interaction of any country with the rest of the world is increasing by every second. So it's useful to know about the issues that this brings forward, that this raises, and how an economy can cope with these. In our next lecture, we will conclude discussion on international finance and then look at a little bit about the issues confronting developing countries or poor countries. So till our next lecture, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.